Norm Stamper, I just wanted to wrap with a final question about what happened here 10 years ago. You know, it's very interesting to come back to Seattle now in 2009. It was, of course, the end of November in 1999 that the Battle of Seattle took place. You were the police chief here. It might surprise many people to hear the sort of trajectory you've gone on now, but I'm wondering about your reflections now 10 years later. I mean, at this time, 10 years later, the global economic meltdown, where the people in the streets 10 years ago were really taking on this issue of unbridled corporate power globalizing around the world. What are you thinking today about the reaction of Seattle 10 years ago?
Well, clearly the battle in Seattle is my legacy. 1 week out of my 34 years defines me as a cop and as a police chief. And I can bemoan the unfairness of that, but it is true for many people. That's the only way they know me. And I made major mistakes leading up to that week and during that week. And all I can say is that I'm awfully sorry I didn't do certain things and that I did do other things. Most of that is contained in my book, and I'm grateful for your mention of that book. There is a chapter entitled Snookered in Seattle. Having said that, what was accomplished during that week was to put globalization and anti-globalization into our vocabulary and to put the whole issue on the map. I really strongly believe that the experience during that week framed a whole lot of issues that people didn't think about at all prior to that time. And I think, as you've described it, we're now reaping what we have sown in the form of unbridled globalization and unfettered free trade. And I think it's time for all of us in this country to, as we attempt to pull ourselves out of this global economic meltdown, to really take a look at what issues of social and economic justice mean within the context of globalization.
And Norm Stamper, what's been the reaction of your colleagues in law enforcement? I know there are many who support your view, but those who work side by side with you as you become more outspoken on this issue of reforming the marijuana laws?
Well, last week in Minnesota, before a state House committee, a committee that is considering medical marijuana, I was accused of disrespecting police officers. I quickly corrected that police chief who was wearing a yellow tie with the language, police lines do not cross. I apologized if I gave the impression, because I have the deepest respect for frontline police officers. They didn't make these laws. They are victims of the tension and the hostility that is associated with enforcing or prosecuting the drug war. So it's not our frontline cops that we need to be concerned about. The vast majority of police officers, I believe, would legalize marijuana today. They have varying views on the other drugs. Many officers, including police chiefs and sheriffs, have whispered their support to me. When I say, well, may I quote you? Their response is, what have you been smoking? No, you cannot do that. You know, some have suggested that President Obama's dismissal of the marijuana issue last week in the online town hall meeting was done because it's the third rail. Well, we've made it that. Americans have, in fact, bought the propaganda of the drug war. We can't conceive of it as a public health issue, this whole issue of drug use and drug abuse and prevention and education and treatment, as well as enforcement. We need to rethink it. We need to have the courage, the will, and sort of the analytical take on the systemic implications that are associated with the drug war and recognize that there is a much better alternative out there. And I think a whole lot of cops understand it. Certainly the 10,000 members of law enforcement against prohibition get it.
Finally, Norm Stamper, though we said finally before, just back on that point, when you said you felt you made many mistakes 10 years ago, what did you feel was your major mistake at the time?
not vetoing a decision to use chemical agents, also known as tear gas, against hundreds of nonviolent demonstrators. That was on the first morning of the major emergence, if you will, of the conflict, of the hostilities. I honestly believed at that time, and did for 5 years after my retirement. It was only on book tour and listening to a whole lot of people who were in that city at that time that I concluded that there was an alternative to what we did. Just quickly, tactically speaking, we had a huge intersection, strategic intersection, through which aid cars and police officers and fire units could not travel if they were needed for any kind of a medical emergency, even unassociated with the World Trade Organization conference. And so the company blessed that decision. Warning was given. It was announced repeatedly. I personally was present at the time. I walked to the far side of the crowd to make sure that the legal warning that was given through the bullhorn could be heard, that it was clear, that the ramifications of disobedience would be understood by all. And I blessed that decision, and as I said, for 5 years after, supported it. The chief in me, however, should have stepped in and said, yes, it is possible that a woman giving birth in an office building or a local hotel, somebody in cardiac arrest on the 27th floor of the Sheraton, would be difficult for us to reach. But what really are the odds of that happening? The company said, doesn't matter what the odds are, we need to be available, we need to be ready. The chief in me should have said, for the greater good, we ought not to have brought those chemical agents out. We ought not to have, I think, raised the stakes. I do not fault people at the scene. I fault myself.
Well, Norm Stamper, I want to thank you for being with us. He's written a book about his experiences as a top cop here in Seattle, the police chief during the Battle of Seattle, and now a spokesperson for the legalization of drugs, speaking to us via video stream from his home in the Orcas Islands. His book is called Breaking Rank, a top cop's expose of the dark side of American policing. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll be joined by a top health policy professor here at UW, University of Washington, about the healthcare crisis. Stay with us.